the night Tobias Hargrove stopped breathing. For the third time, the doctors told his wife to start thinking about funeral arrangements. That was on a Thursday. By Sunday, a young woman named Cora was sitting on the floor of his hospital room, mixing something in a clay bowl she had carried all the way from rural Mississippi, wrapped in a dish towel and tucked into the bottom of a garbage bag that held everything she owned. Nobody had asked her to be there. Nobody had wanted her there. But she was there, and before the week was out, Tobias Hargrove, the man whose name was on 3 buildings in downtown Atlanta, opened his eyes for the first time in 11 days and asked for water. This is how it happened. Cora Jeffries was 26 years old when she arrived at the Greyhound station on Forsyth Street with $43 and no plan. She had grown up in Natchez, Mississippi, in a house her grandmother had built with her own hands out on a dirt road that didn't have a proper name, just a color, Red Road. Everybody called it, because of the clay. Her grandmother, Mama Odette, had lived on that road for 71 years, and she had never once gone to a hospital, not because she couldn't, because she said she didn't need to. Mama Odette knew plants the way other people know their own children. She knew which root to boil for a fever, which leaf to press against a wound, which bark to scrape and steep in hot water when a person's chest sounded wrong in the night. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before that, going back in an unbroken line to women whose names Cora never knew but whose knowledge lived in Mama Odette's hands like something breathing. Cora had grown up watching. She hadn't tried to learn it, not exactly. She just watched the way you watch anything that's always there. The way you watch the sky without meaning to memorize it. And then one day you're somewhere else and you know without thinking that the clouds mean rain. Mama Odette died in February, and by April, Cora had nothing left in Natchez to hold her. The house on Red Road passed to a cousin who'd never set foot in it and sold it within the month. The job at the laundry closed. The friend she'd thought she could stay with had troubles of her own, so Cora packed what she could carry and bought a bus ticket to Atlanta, because she had heard there was work there, and because Atlanta was far enough away that she could stop feeling like the ground was still shaking under her feet. It wasn't far enough, but she didn't know that yet. She spent her first week in Atlanta sleeping in the bus station and pretending she had just arrived each time security came through. She spent her second week in a shelter on Pryor Street, in a room with 11 other women, where the lights went on at 5 in the morning and you had to be out of the building by 7. She walked all day, every day, going into stores and restaurants and office buildings and asking about work. Most people looked past her. A few were kind. Nobody hired her. It was on one of those long walking days that she met Paulette. Paulette was 40-something, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, even when she wasn't reading anything. She was sitting outside a coffee shop on Peachtree, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback. And she looked up at Cora and said, "You look like you've been walking since yesterday." Cora said she had been walking since 6 in the morning. Paulette said, "Sit down then," and moved her bag off the chair. They talked for almost an hour. Paulette was a home health aide, had been for 12 years. She asked Cora where she was from and what she knew how to do, and Cora told her about Natchez and the laundry and Mama Odette. When Cora mentioned the plants, Paulette tilted her head and got a look on her face that was hard to read. "You know about herbal medicine? Like actually know it?" Cora said she knew some things. She didn't like to overstate it. Paulette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've got a client. I work for this family over in Buckhead. They've got," she paused, choosing her words, "they've got a situation. I can't promise anything, but they need somebody to help out in the house right now. And if you're willing to work hard, and you don't talk out of turn, I could mention your name." Cora said she was willing. Paulette wrote down an address on a napkin and told her to come the next morning at 8. The Hargrove house was not what Cora expected, and she didn't know what she had expected, but it wasn't this. A pale stone house set back from the road behind iron gates, with a circular driveway and a row of dogwood trees along the left side that were just coming into bloom. It looked like a photograph. It looked like a place where nothing bad had ever happened, but something bad was happening inside. Tobias Hargrove had been sick for 4 months. Nobody could say exactly what was wrong with him. It had started with fatigue, the kind that a man like Tobias, who had never been tired a day in his life, could not explain or accept. Then came the weakness in his legs, then the tremors in his hands, then episodes where he would simply stop up in the middle of a sentence and stare at nothing for a full minute before coming back. He had seen 6 specialists. He had been admitted to Emory twice. He had flown to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota and spent a week undergoing every test they had. The results came back the same way every time: inconclusive, abnormal but unidentifiable. Something was wrong with Tobias Hargrove's nervous system, and no one could say what it was or what to do about it. His wife, Vivian, no, not Vivian, that name was taken from a prior story. His wife's name was Celestine. Celestine Hargrove was 51 years old and had been married to Tobias for 23 years. She was a woman who handled things. That was how people described her. Celestine handles things. She had handled the death of their first child, a son who didn't survive his first week. She had handled Tobias's first business failure, when he lost nearly everything at 40 and rebuilt it by 45. She had handled every crisis that came at her family with a kind of quiet ferocity that made other people feel steadied just by being near her. But watching her husband disappear, because that was what it felt like, disappearance, not illness, was something Celestine could not handle. Not because she wasn't strong enough, because there was nothing to handle, nothing to push against, nothing to fix. When Cora arrived that first morning, Paulette met her at the gate and walked her through the house and told her the rules. Don't disturb Mr. Hargrove if the door is closed. Don't ask Mrs. Hargrove questions unless she asks you something first. Don't touch the things in the front room. Start with the kitchen, then the upstairs hallway, then whatever Celestine points to. Cora nodded. She was good at listening. What nobody told her to do was notice things, but she noticed them anyway. It was the way she was built. She noticed that the house smelled wrong. Not dirty, it was immaculately clean. Every surface polished, flowers in the entryway replaced every few days. But underneath the cleaning products and the candles, there was something else. A smell she had only encountered once before, years ago, when a man in Natchez came to Mama Odette's door and stood on the porch looking gray and shrunken while his wife explained what was happening to him. Mama Odette had gone inside and come back out with a handful of dried plants and said, very quietly, that the man needed to stop drinking water from the well on the east side of his property. The man had looked at her like she had lost her mind. 3 weeks later, he came back. He was standing up straight. He had color in his face. He never said what he had done differently. Cora was 16 when that happened. She hadn't thought about it in years. But something about the Hargrove house brought it back to her. Not the memory exactly, but the feeling attached to it. The particular combination of smells, the way the air sat in the rooms. She didn't say anything. She swept the kitchen floor and wiped down the counters and moved on to the upstairs hallway. She had been hired to clean, and she cleaned, but she was thinking. She thought about it for a week. During that week, she watched Tobias on the days when Celestine let him come downstairs and sit in the back sunroom. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned not to trust his own body. His hands shook when he lifted a glass. Some mornings he was better. Some mornings he was worse. And Cora started to notice that the worst mornings always came after he had spent a long time in a particular chair near the window in the sitting room, where the afternoon light came through and warmed the air. She noticed the plants on the windowsill of that room, ornamental plants, the kind people put in houses for decoration. Celestine probably hadn't thought twice about them. They had probably been there for years. Cora knew what they were. Mama Odette had shown her once, pointed them out in a neighbor's yard and said, "Don't let anybody put those inside a house where somebody is ailing." Said the compounds in the leaves could build up in a person's system over time, slow and quiet, until the body didn't know how to function right anymore. Said no test would catch it because no doctor would think to look for it. Cora stood in that room for a long time, looking at the plants. She went back and forth with herself about it. She was the new cleaning woman. She had been hired 3 weeks ago. She had no medical degree, no credentials, nothing on paper that gave her the right to walk up to a grieving woman in a house like this and say what she thought she knew. Celestine would probably look at her the way that man in Natchez had looked at Mama Odette. The doctors had run every test. What could a 26-year-old woman from Mississippi possibly know that 6 specialists had missed? But the man in Natchez had gotten better, and Tobias Hargrove was getting worse. The night she finally decided to say something was the night Tobias went to the hospital for the 3rd time. She was still in the house when the ambulance came. Celestine had asked her to stay late, to help prepare for a family member who was coming to stay. And she watched from the upstairs hallway as they carried him out on a gurney. Celestine walked beside him with her hand on his arm, not saying anything, her face completely still. Cora sat down on the top step of the stairs after they left and stayed there for a while. The house was empty and quiet, and the ornamental plants on the windowsill were still there, catching the last of the evening light. She made her decision. The next morning she went to the hospital. She asked the woman at the front desk for Celestine Hargrove, and after about 20 minutes of waiting, Celestine came out to the lobby wearing the same clothes she'd had on the night before. Celestine looked at her. "Cora, why are you here?" "I need to tell you something," Cora said, "and I need you to hear me out before you say anything. I know how this is going to sound." Celestine was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down in one of the lobby chairs and folded her hands in her lap and said, "All right." Cora told her everything. She told her about Mama Odette, about the man on the porch in Natchez, about the plants on the windowsill of the sitting room. She told her what Mama Odette had said about those particular plants and what they could do over time. Slow and cumulative, the kind of thing that didn't show up in blood panels or neurological scans, because it wasn't a disease with a name. It was just the body being quietly overwhelmed by something it hadn't been built to process in those quantities. She told her which plants to look up, giving their Latin names carefully, the way Mama Odette had drilled them into her. She told her what to tell the doctors. She told her it might be nothing. She said, "I could be completely wrong. I just couldn't stay quiet and not tell you." Celestine listened to all of it without speaking. When Cora finished, there was a long silence. Celestine looked at her lap, then out through the glass doors of the hospital lobby, then back at Cora. "The plants have been in that room for 7 years, Celestine said. "Yes, ma'am." "He started getting sick about 5 months ago." "Yes, ma'am." Mama Odette said, "It builds up. It's not immediate. It takes time." Celestine was quiet again. Then she said, "You understand that I have 6 specialists who have been treating my husband. I have doctors from some of the best hospitals in the country who have looked at every possible cause." "I understand," Cora said. "And you're telling me it's a plant in my sitting room. I'm telling you it might be. I'm not a doctor. I could be wrong. I just—" Cora stopped, steadied herself. "I would want somebody to tell me." Celestine looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was hard to name. Not anger, not dismissal, but something more complicated. The look of a woman who had run out of other options and knew it. "I'll talk to his doctor," Celestine said. She did more than talk. She had the plants removed from the house that same day and had a specialist in toxicology brought in to evaluate Tobias. The toxicologist ran tests that had not been part of the original panel. They were looking for specific compounds now, compounds with names that matched what Cora had given Celestine in that hospital lobby. The results came back 48 hours later. The levels were significant, elevated enough to explain every symptom, the neurological episodes, the tremors, the weakness, the inexplicable deterioration that had baffled every other specialist, all of it traceable to a slow, sustained accumulation of compounds that the body cannot safely process in concentration. The toxicologist said it was one of the more unusual cases he had seen. Not because it was medically complex, but because it was so simple and so easy to miss if you weren't thinking to look. He asked how the family had known to flag it. Celestine said a young woman had told her. He asked what the young woman's background was. Celestine said she was a cleaning lady from Mississippi whose grandmother had taught her. The toxicologist didn't say anything to that. He wrote in his notes and moved on. What happened after that happened slowly, the way real recoveries do, without the sharp, dramatic turning point that people expect. Tobias came home from the hospital and spent 2 weeks barely getting out of bed. Then he started sitting up. Then he started eating more. Then one morning, Cora came in, and he was standing at the kitchen counter drinking coffee. And he looked up when she came in and said, "You're Cora." She said, "Yes," he said. "Celestine told me what you did." She said she hadn't really done anything. She had just passed along something her grandmother had told her once. He shook his head slowly. "My grandmother used to say that the people who save your life don't always look like saviors." He looked at her for a moment. She was right. Cora didn't know what to say to that, so she said she was glad he was feeling better, and she went to start on the kitchen. Tobias was back on his feet by August. Not all the way. There were still days when his hands were unsteady, and the fatigue came down on him without warning, but the trajectory had reversed. He was coming back. Everyone could feel it. Celestine moved through the house differently. She laughed at dinner. She slept. It was in September that Celestine sat Cora down at the kitchen table and asked her about her life. Not in the polite surface way that employers sometimes do. She asked real questions and waited for real answers. And Cora found herself talking about Natchez and Mama Odette and Red Road, and the years of watching and the knowledge that lived in her hands without her having chosen it. Celestine listened the way. She listened to everything, completely, without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you want to do with your life, Cora?" Cora had thought about this. She had thought about it for years, actually, in the way you think about something that feels too big to say out loud. "I want to do what Mama Odette did," she said. "But I want to understand it the way doctors understand medicine. I want to know both sides, the science and the old knowledge. I want to be able to stand in a room with those specialists and have them hear me." Celestine was quiet for a moment. "Then that's what you should do," she said. "I didn't finish high school," Cora said. "I know. We can start there." What Celestine offered was not charity, and she made sure Cora understood that. It was investment. It was also, Celestine said quietly, the only form of repayment she could think of that was proportionate to what had been given to her. Her husband was alive. Her family was intact. A woman from Mississippi, who had learned plant medicine from her grandmother in a house on a red clay road, had saved Tobias Hargrove's life using knowledge that no hospital in the country had thought to access. The least Celestine could do was make sure that knowledge had somewhere to grow. Cora finished her G in 6 months. She was accepted to a pre-nursing program in the spring. She was not a natural student in the way that comes easy. She had to work hard for every grade, stay up late, go over things twice. But she was a natural learner, which is different, and she understood things at the level of application, the level where knowledge becomes action, in a way that her instructors noticed and commented on. She still called Paulette every Sunday. Paulette would say, "How's school going?" And Cora would say, "Hard," and Paulette would say, "Good. Hard means it's real." She called Paulette on the Sunday after she got her first A, and Paulette was quiet on the phone for a second, and then she said, "Your grandmother would have loved to hear that." Cora had to step outside for a moment. She stood on the sidewalk in front of her apartment building, the small apartment that Celestine had helped her find, that she was paying for herself now with a part-time job at the hospital, and she looked up at the sky, which was going orange at the edges. And she thought about Mama Odette on Red Road in Natchez. She thought about how the old woman had sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the light go, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. How she had known things that nobody had written down. How she had pressed knowledge into Cora's hands without making it feel like a lesson. Just a life, just living, just the way things were on a dirt road where the clay ran red. Cora thought, "I didn't know I was carrying something. I thought I was just watching." But she had been carrying it the whole time. That February, Tobias Hargrove returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but to make an announcement. He stood at a podium in a conference room on the 4th floor and told a room, when full of doctors and administrators, that he was funding a new initiative at the hospital. A research partnership between the hospital's neurology and toxicology departments and practitioners of traditional plant medicine from across the American South. The goal was to create a formal framework for integrating what he called inherited knowledge, the kind of knowledge that lived in families and communities and couldn't be found in a textbook, into standard clinical practice. He talked for about 15 minutes. At the end, he said that the initiative was named after a woman in Mississippi, and that her granddaughter was sitting in the third row and was going to be, he said with some certainty, a remarkable doctor someday. Cora was looking at her hands when he said it. She had been trying not to cry for the better part of an hour. She thought about Mama Odette. She thought about the clay bowl she still kept on her windowsill, the one she had carried from Natchez in a garbage bag on a Greyhound bus with $43 and no plan. She used it sometimes when she was studying, when she needed to think. She would turn it in her hands and remember the smell of the house on Red Road and the sound of her grandmother's voice, unhurried, naming things. She thought, I have to go back to Natchez, not to live. She knew her life was here now, in Atlanta, in the hospital corridors and the textbooks, and the long, necessary work of becoming someone who could stand in a room and be heard. But she had to go back and find the women on the road who were still there, still sitting on their porches, still knowing things that nobody had thought to write down. She had to go back and listen the way she hadn't known how to listen when she was young. She owed them that. She owed Mama Odette that. Outside the hospital windows, Atlanta was doing what it always did in February, cold and gray and leaning toward spring. The dogwoods on Peachtree would be bare for another few weeks, but they would bloom. They always did. Cora sat in the third row and held her clay bowl in her lap and thought about everything that was still ahead of her. And for the first time in a long time, the thought didn't feel heavy. It felt like exactly the right kind of weight to carry.